I've titled this lecture Minds Possessed, and I want to offer it as sort of a moral tale. The topic of the lecture covers the 3 centuries, approximately 1400 to 1700, in which tens of thousands of persons in Europe and in the American colonies and in England were tried for witchcraft and in fact were executed. Surely over 80% of them being women, and in fact the percentage was probably higher than that. In many instances, men who were tried for this and executed were because they had lived for a long time with those judged to be witches, and part of the witch theory occasionally included the notion that it was infectious or catching, or if you spent too much time around such people, you'd come away with some of their sins, actually. Now, it's a bit of a moral tale because in this 3 centuries, there were fairly well-developed trial procedures, rules of evidence, medicine not as a developed science by any means, but certainly medical people, trained people who otherwise were able to diagnose and provide remedies for one disorder or another. There was a definite attempt on the part of both the church and the secular authorities to make sure that no one was unfairly charged with this, and when charged with this, had an opportunity to mount an appropriate defense. And of course, at the end of the day, there was the desire to liberate the bewitched from bewitchment so that one's eternal soul could know God, even if to do this, one's less than eternal body had to be set afire. So what we have here is a 3-century affair which will cover the period that includes Galileo and Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon and the development of what we take to be modern science, a period that includes almost all of what we take to be the great achievements of the Renaissance in humanistic scholarship and art and architecture, a period in which canon law is refined and developed, a period in which the ancient law of Rome and Roman legal procedures are again in the hands of the Western world and are being used to great effect in all sorts of contractual negotiations, the settlement of disputes, and the like. In other words, this is all going on at a time when it shouldn't be going on, so to speak. So we have some reason to ask, how could this particular psychology, this theory about human mental life, this theory about moral responsibility, come to take the form that it did and count so many innocent persons in this massive body count that becomes ever more macabre as we learn more about it? Well, let me begin by saying that there's no time in recorded history that doesn't make some room for witches. And indeed, there's no time in the recorded law of the West that doesn't make some provision for what it is you're supposed to do with witches just in case you find one. Rome's 12 Tables, which is about as foundational for Western jurisprudence as any document can be, if we can refer to stone tables as a document. Rome's 12 Tables makes provision for dealing with destruction achieved through witchcraft. So this is very, very old. But of course, in the ancient world, a distinction was made between a witch who, for example, would provide herbs or ointments of one kind or another, or deliver up incantations that had very positive effects. It would get rid of a wart on the nose, or have your palsy diminished and whatever, doing good things, the so-called white witch, who is referred to as a lamia, and that other kind of witch whose workings produced evil, destruction, pain, punishment, loss of property, death of cattle, and the like. One who actually perpetrated evil, perpetrated what in the ancient Roman law was referred to as a maleficium. Now, the distinction in the ancient world was important because if, in fact, you practiced white magic, the law virtually ignored you entirely, took no notice of it. You might be regarded as some sort of pest. You certainly would be regarded as a hopeless eccentric, but if you weren't bothering anybody, you weren't doing any harm, then that was that. The law took no notice of you, though your family might be encouraged to have you comport yourself in such a way that wouldn't frighten children or horses. Now, this started changing in the Christian era, and it started changing for reasons that are subtle, not easily traced briefly, but which can be illuminated briefly. Now let me start this part of the tale by noting the great stress that Christianity lays to personal responsibility, moral responsibility. The fact that by your intentions, your moral standing can be known. This great stress also accentuates what historically is referred to as the free will determinism issue. And once you begin to consider the terms of Christian teaching, you begin to see how important this is. If in fact terrestrial life, our earthly life, which is numbered in days, is just a stage set on which we express and develop and satisfy just those conditions by which we would warrant eternal salvation, then in fact, in order for us properly and justly to be judged in terms of how we conduct ourselves in this life, our actions must be within our powers. There must be sufficient moral freedom for us to be held responsible for what we do. So that part of the story is fairly basic, fairly well in place. It might be of some interest to note that although I think a case can be made out for the proposition that ancient Greek philosophy recognizes the free will determinism issue and to some extent deals with it, it is quite a remarkable fact that the classic ancient philosophical texts do not dilate on the question of free will. Aristotle makes distinctions between actions that are sort of intended, the ekousios, and those that are unintended, akousios, but there isn't a sustained argument about free will and its limits and the like. This really is put in place during the period of Christian philosophical and psychological thought. Now, just in case it's possible for satanic influences, for the devil himself, so to occupy an individual as to steal that person of that person's moral autonomy, then you would never be in a position to judge wrongdoing as in fact something that is blameworthy. There always would be the possibility that indeed the devil just made this person do it. And you'd have this peculiar situation of the church itself not being in a position to determine whether an act is a sinful act. For it to be a sinful act, it has to be something intended by the actor. And it also has to be something which the actor could forbear from doing. Not only something the actor could do, but something the actor could forbear from doing. Now, if you put that in one position, as this tale develops, we then get to a second consideration that's vital if we're to understand this 3 centuries of witch prosecutions and persecutions. And that has to do with how one understands the achievement of the witch. One understands the successful practice of witchcraft as achieving something that ordinarily cannot be achieved by natural means, that is, bringing something about in an unnatural way. Obviously, if what comes about is entirely predictable given the very order of nature, then there's no reason to suspect witchcraft. But if something comes about that is outside the order of nature, it isn't natural. And if it isn't natural, it is, in a manner of speaking, above the natural. It is supernatural. So the witch, then, is displaying powers of a supernatural nature. Now, how is it that she can do that? Well, there can only be 2 sources of the supernatural. There can be the divine source, and there can be the satanic source. One, in fact, can take on supernatural powers or be given supernatural powers by the dark angel. Now, if you put 1 and 2 together, you start developing what has come to be called the witch theory in the very late medieval and Renaissance period. The witch theory goes something like this. No one actually can be robbed of their free will and at the same time be worthy of judgment. And those persons, therefore, who take on supernatural powers and do so because they are supplied these powers by Satan, must have entered into a pact with Satan agreeably. This doesn't mean that the witch actually has conversed with Satan, but there must be something in her nature that constituted a willing entering into some kind of pact knowingly doing so, and therefore being responsible for it. In the Latin, it was referred to as the pactum implicitum. It was an implicit pact. Even if it weren't explicit, it was implicit. It's the only way of accounting at once for the exercise of these supernatural powers and at the same time granting the continuing free will and autonomy of the witch. So the devil cannot impose his will willy-nilly. The devil has to find a workshop in which these pacts are likely to be entered into. Now, of course, if there are trial procedures in place, and if you want to do this in such a way as to pass muster, and sincerely pass muster, as regards the juridical adjudicative processes that have been passed on by Rome, then there's going to have to be evidence adduced in support of the claim that this particular person is a witch. How that evidence is obtained becomes important. Torture will be allowed. Torture is allowed, but in fact, no admission gained during the period of torture can be used against the witch. She must then and later in open court admit to her witchery, even though the original admission was secured through torture. If she's pregnant, she's not to be tortured. If she's pregnant and found guilty, she's not to be executed. Rather, she's to give birth to the baby, and I'm sorry to say, usually within a month of that, then executed. She's not to be racked more than twice in any given period, and that period of torture, duress, and the like is to be finite. So all these things allegedly were in place. I could provide ample evidence for the fact that, well, as the witch persecutor at Dreisiger said to one of his victims, who, by the way, happened to be pregnant, "I do not torture you for an hour, and I do not torture you for a day, or for a week, or for a month. I will torture you for your lifetime, and if you do not own up to what you've done, I'll torture you nonetheless, and then I will run the sword through you." So there was great variation in the practices, even though officially and technically the authorities were trying to rein in some of these practices. But there did have to be evidence. Now, what kind of evidence was admissible? Well, you were charged with doing something. You caused my sheep to die, or my barn burned down after you said in an angry dispute with me that you would get back at me. Now, of course, under ordinary procedures, even at the time, certainly by the 12th century or the 13th century, the accusatorial process being what it was, I would have the right to face you in open court, to hear the charge that you are bringing against me, and if I could successfully defeat that charge, I would be in a position to collect damages. And this constituted a damping effect on reckless charges. In dealing with the witch, however, the courts came to a rather different kind of reasoning, namely the accusers could not be identified. Why? Because given the power of the witch, the accusers would be vulnerable. So, here you've got an accusatorial process, but you don't have the ordinary corrective for the accusatorial process, which after all is the countersuit once you've identified who your accuser is and what the accuser has said. More than that, even the accusatorial component was muted because the charge of witchcraft was such now as to invite both secular and clerical authorities. All witchcraft was now viewed as a species of heresy, because if you've entered into a pact with the devil, you in fact have declared yourself a heretic, and this is a grave offense. It's an offense against God, it's an offense against cross and crown. The question, who prosecuted more vigorously, you might be surprised to know, I think all things considered, one's chances in an ecclesiastical court probably were a little bit better than one's chances in a secular court, because the princes of Europe were hell-bent on establishing the orthodoxy of their Christianity and remaining in favor with the church and showing that they were more papal than the Pope and holier than the priests and the like. I gild the lily a little bit, but I do think that the trial records would sustain the view that, if anything, you suffered more in the secular courts than in the ecclesiastical courts. Well, now what we need is some evidence of a scientific nature. We're not going to go solely by hearsay, and after all, nobody was there to see the witch causing this fire in the barn, and a witch can cause a barn to go on fire without her even being there. She can, by witchery, do this. She might fly off with her coven in the middle of the night and drive the animals mad. Nobody is going to see this. So certain tests were developed to establish whether or not someone indeed was a witch, and I should rehearse just a couple of those tests for you. There was, for example, the flotation test. Now, the way this test was administered is the person charged with, arraigned for witchcraft, would be put in the middle of a deep tub of water that would otherwise be higher than her own height. But she would be suspended in this pool by a circle of men holding her suspended by the end of very, very long sticks. They'd have poles just reaching over to keep her body suspended. Freudians, of course, would have a field day with this whole spectacle, to say no more on the subject. And then at a given point, the poles would be pulled back, and the question is, does she float? Does she sink? If she floats, that's positive evidence of witchcraft. This tied in with a certain theory about how the gravity of the soul is altered when the devil is allowed entry and the like. So that's one test. It's not the decisive test, but the flotation test is one of a number of tests. Then there was the famous tear test. Now, the way the tear test was administered is someone practiced in this form of interrogation would stand before the accused and would recite a more or less official text having to do with Jesus sacrificing himself for all humanity, allowing himself to be crucified in forgiveness of our sins, the blood of his tortured body pouring down onto the face of his adoring mother, whose rivulets of tears would, etc., etc., etc. And at the end of this reading, the witch would be looked at directly, pointed at, and she would be told, "Now do you cry?" And if she could not form tears after this extraordinary and lamentable account of Christ's suffering on the cross, that also was evidence, because in entering into a pact with the devil, one had a diminished capacity for remorse, and so tears would not form. Well, of course, sometimes tears did form. In fact, James I, who wrote a book on demonology, this is something he backed away from a little later in his reign, but in James I's book on demonology, he warns those who are applying the tear test not to be gulled by, quote, the tears of the crocodile. So James I wants the evidence gatherers to recognize that you can be taken in by one who can feign remorse and actually form tears inauthentically. Now then there was the third test, which was designed to locate the devil's mark. Because when this pact is entered into, for the devil to provide the powers necessary to achieve what witchery achieves, there has to be some kind of physical occupation or physical influence within the body. And where the devil has provided this, there will be a mark somewhere on the body. It'll be a region that is insensitive. And if you carefully use calipers, little pricking devices, and you shave the body completely, and strip it down so that the person charged now is completely nude and shaven, and you systematically probe the body, it's important to recognize that the devil, cunning as he is likely to leave his mark in the most remote places. The practiced witch pricker will be able to find that devil's mark, and thus additional proof, additional evidence of witchcraft. Persons made a decent living as witch prickers, and you can guess what some of the motives behind that form of work might have been. Now, in the 15th century, the procedures required for doing these tests right, for understanding what the nature of witchcraft is, for saving the immortal soul from the wages of sin arising from the implicit pact, the official book on this was the Malleus Maleficarum, which was written by 2 Dominican priests and which became the official handbook for the better part of a century. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. This was the book, and it was consulted by kings and bishops alike. we find this passage in the Malleus Maleficarum. And is it not wonderful that witches are able to undergo this trial by ordeal unscathed with the help of devils? For we learn from naturalists that if the hands be anointed with the juice of a certain herb, they are protected from burning. Now the devil has an exact knowledge of the virtues of such herbs. Therefore, although he can cause the hand of the accused to be protected from red-hot iron by invisibly interposing some other substance, yet he can procure the same effect by the use of natural objects. Now, what the Malleus is making clear here, what the Malleus Maleficarum is making clear here, is that you might need additional expert testimony from herbalists and from, well, we'd call them doctors now. The question is, could this particular effect be produced naturally? Well, of course, the devil has a complete knowledge of natural remedies and the like. Is it your suspicion, doctor? Is it your suspicion, father, witch pricker, expert? Is it your position that in this particular case, the effect we see really is brought about by entirely natural means, or brought about by supernatural means, or perhaps brought about by the devil, but using natural means to bring it about? What we have is the dawn of expert testimony in trials in which the offense is at the level of the psychological, the spiritual, the eccentric, the mental, and the like. When you find something you can't quite deal with, you don't own up to the possibility that there can be no expertise here. You find such expertise as might be around and might be promoting itself just that way. So doctors and priests are routinely called upon in hard cases or even in ordinary cases to provide what at the time was taken to be evidence. Well, by the 16th century, there's some skepticism being expressed toward this entire venture. Johann Weyer, W-E-Y-E-R, wrote a text that in many respects really is something of a psychiatric treatise, having to do with the power of demons and also alerting people to the fact that what they're calling evidence really can be explained in entirely different terms. Note this. It's the 16th century, and Weyer has no doubt at all but that there are witches. He has no doubt at all but that Satan does work his evil in the world. What he wants to do is refine the procedures. He's particularly concerned that so many women are being subjected to these trials and persecutions. He notes, for example, regarding the flotation test, most of the people called up on charges of witchcraft are not only women, they are elderly women. Their bones are very light and porous. He's a doctor and he knows this. He says it's quite obvious that they might float for reasons that are entirely natural and skeletal. One has to be very careful about using evidence of that kind. It's also the case that as one ages, one's capacity for lacrimation is diminished. It could be that tears are not formed as readily, again, owing to age. Now, I don't want to say that Johann Weyer put an end to any of this. Rather, he is an important voice expressing itself in the 16th century and recording some degree of skepticism regarding the adequacy of these tests, even while accepting the witch theory itself. In 1628, one of the great works in a much neglected work, one of the great works in the Western canon appears. It's Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. This is a 1,000-page treatise. It's a rich psychiatric work. It's anthropological. It's various. It's medical and scientific. It's wonderful as literature. The part of this work I would draw your attention to has to do with the whole question of mental aberrations and how they should best be understood. And it's in the chapter that in which he takes up questions of witchcraft and possession and the like. For Burton, the evidence was complete enough for an objective scholar to declare that diseases of the mind, and here's Burton's quote, have their chief seat and origins in the head, close quote. And that the diseases arising from the brain proper include, for Burton, quote, frenzy, lethargy, melancholy, madness, weak memory, sleeping sickness, insomnia, close quote. Those especially prone to madness, Burton tells us, especially prone to melancholia, include both sexes, men more frequently, but women more violently. People, just in case you think this is modernity speaking, let me give you the added words here. People born under the moon, Saturn or Mercury, people with little heads, hot hearts, cold stomachs, moist brains, and melancholy parents. Now, what the 17th century is yielding here in Burton, and Burton is a luminary in this regard. He has one of the most fully prepared minds for anyone who would take on something like the anatomy of melancholy. It really should be called a textbook in morbid psychology. That's what it is. It's a textbook in abnormal psychology. Here's Burton. It's the 17th century. The book comes out in 1628. Francis Bacon is alive. Galileo is alive. Descartes is alive. All that. We're still talking about people born under the moon or born under Saturn. We're still talking about people who have small heads, who have moist stomachs, who have parents of a certain stripe and the like. So what do we see in this? We see in the 17th century 1 foot in a world of superstition, natural magic, dark forces, another foot in that world that is just around the corner, which is a modern scientific world. It's not a world of natural magic, it's a world of natural science, a world in which we discover the causes of things by doing the right kind of research, where theory is held in abeyance until confirming evidence is produced, and where there even is a growing recognition that any theory will find support in any kind of evidence if you're willing to make radical adjustments in your orienting assumptions. Well, what is the moral tale that I hope to have conveyed with this story about minds possessed? First, theories come quite easily to us when we seek to explain the aberrant or eccentric behavior of others. Secondly, we tend to describe those who are different from ourselves not in the neutral terms of merely different, but in the evaluative terms of sick, diseased, sinful. Thirdly, sometimes in our solicitude, we take out after those to cure them of diseases that exist only in our theories and not in them. Fourthly, as reasonable and judicious people, when we set out to do this, we want to be sure that we're using the right kind of method, that we have the right kind of data, that indeed if there's something actually juridical or adjudicative going on, that we even have settled and defensible trial procedures. I've rehearsed the witch panic for you. Shouldn't call it a panic, it went on for over 3 centuries, to say that all these considerations were operative at the time, that the motives by and large were probably salutary and even laudable motives, and that the conduct was deplorable. The victims numerous and savaged, the complacency enduring for the better part of 300 years. The moral tale is, once you're absolutely sure what makes Smith tick, you know everything about him you would care to know, look in the mirror and say 3 times, I may be wrong, I may be very wrong, I may be hopelessly wrong. And you'll probably be right. Thanks very much.